The eternal promise pierced the heart. Of the silence, like a spear of light thrown into endless darkness, Yansu watched from the bridge of the prismatic dawn as the flagships, fold space disruptors activated at maximum power, tearing open a wound in reality larger than any created before. But this time, something different happened. The tear did not simply mirror the silence's nature. Instead, it reflected it, creating an endless loop of darkness facing darkness. The entity that had consumed stars and devoured civilizations suddenly found itself staring into its own void. For a moment that seemed to stretch across eternity, nothing moved. The silence hung suspended at the edge of reality, trapped between the urge to consume and the impossibility of consuming itself. Then the reflection began to fold inward. The darkness collapsed like a star dying in reverse, pulling itself into a point so small that even light could not escape. And at the center of that collapse, the eternal promise burned with a brilliance that outshone every sun in the system. "Farewell, friends," came Admiral Minchun's voice over the fleet channel, calm and steady to the very end. "Tell our story, and remember that we were glad to stand beside you." The light grew brighter and brighter until Yansu had to shield her crystalline eyes from its intensity. Then there was silence. True silence. The absence of threat rather than the presence of consumption. The silence was gone, and the eternal promise was gone with it. For a long moment, no one spoke across the combined fleet. Beings of a dozen different species stared at the place where the darkness had been, struggling to comprehend what had just happened. The entity that had hunted humanity for 300 years, that had consumed their homeworld and driven them across the stars, had been destroyed, but the cost had been beyond measure. "All vessels, report status," came a human voice over the command channel. It was Captain Su Yian of the carrier Undying Spirit. Now the senior surviving human officer, her voice cracked with grief. But she pressed on. "We need damage assessments and survivor counts immediately." The reports came in slowly, each one adding weight to the toll of the battle. Of the 14,000 human vessels that had entered the system, fewer than 5,000 remained. The Concorde fleet had suffered lighter losses, but still the number of fallen ships numbered in the hundreds. So many lives, so many sacrifices, all for this moment of victory. Yansu found herself moving before she realized what she was doing. She left the bridge of the prismatic dawn and made her way to the shuttle bay, where a transport was already preparing to depart for Convergence Station. Other representatives were doing the same, drawn by some unspoken understanding that they needed to be together in this moment. When she arrived at the Great Hall of Convergence, she found a scene unlike any in the station's 8,000 years of history. Human survivors mingled with Concorde delegates, their differences of form and culture forgotten in the shared weight of loss and triumph. In one corner, a Kethvorm warrior sat beside a human soldier, their hands clasped in the universal gesture of brotherhood. In another, Mareshi workers clicked in harmony with human engineers, already discussing how to rebuild what had been destroyed. And at the center of the hall, where the 12 thrones normally stood empty except during formal sessions, something new was taking shape. High Commander Vethkai stood before a hastily constructed platform, his scales no longer bristling with aggression, but instead gleaming with the colors of deepest respect. Beside him stood the other leaders of the Concorde, and before them knelt Captain Su Yian and the surviving human command staff. 300 years ago, your people lost everything, Vethkai said, his voice carrying across the silent hall. You wandered the stars, alone and afraid, searching for a home that might never exist. He reached out and placed one massive clawed hand on Su Yian's shoulder. Today, you saved a galaxy that had done nothing to earn your sacrifice. He continued, you gave your ships, your leaders, and your hopes so that strangers might live. The Kethvaran warrior, legendary for his ferocity and his pride. Knelt before the human captain. "The 12 thrones have stood since the founding of the Concord," he said, "but today we add a 13th. A murmur ran through the crowd as the meaning of his words became clear. "Humanity has earned its place among the stars," declared Prime Harmonist Talitha, her gaseous form swirling with colors of joy, "not through conquest, but through sacrifice, not through power, but through love, one by one." The leaders of the 12 Concord species approached the human delegation. The Mareshi offered their hive worlds as sanctuary for humanity's arc ships. The Orlith promised to share their knowledge of atmospheric engineering to help terraform a new homeworld. The Sundari pledged their historians to preserve Earth's memory for all eternity, and the Velethani, through Yeonsu herself, projected patterns of light that spoke words never before shared with outsiders. "Family," she said, her crystalline form blazing with colors that made human eyes water with their beauty. "You are no longer wanderers, no longer refugees, no longer alone." Captain Suyan rose to her feet, tears streaming down her face. "We came to this galaxy hoping to find friends," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "We never imagined we would find a home." She looked around the hall at the beings of a dozen different species who had fought and bled alongside her people, who had watched their leaders sacrifice everything to save a galaxy they had known for barely a week. Admiral Minjun and Ambassador J1 gave their lives believing that humanity had finally found something worth dying for, she said. "But I think they were wrong." She smiled through her tears, and in that smile, Yeonsu saw the same fire that had burned in J1's eyes, the same determination that had driven Minjun into the heart of darkness. They did not find something worth dying for, Su Yan said. They found something worth living for. The hall erupted in cheers, a cacophony of voices and sounds that transcended language and species. Yeonsu felt her crystalline form resonate with the joy around her, her light patterns blazing brighter than they ever had before. The human armada had appeared at the edge of known space, and the galaxy would never be the same, not because of the power it wielded or the enemy it had destroyed, but because of the truth it had revealed, that the smallest and softest beings could carry the greatest fire within them, and that fire, freely given, could illuminate an entire universe. The silence came for Convergence Station on the 7th day. Yeonsu stood on the command deck of the Velethani flagship Prismatic Dawn, watching through the viewport as reality itself began to unravel at the edge of the system. It started as a shimmer, like heat rising from desert sands, but within minutes, the shimmer had grown into a wound that swallowed starlight. Whole the darkness expanded outward in all directions, consuming the distant stars one by one until an entire section of the sky had simply ceased to exist. "All vessels maintain formation," commanded Admiral Minjun from the bridge of the Eternal Promise. His voice carried across the combined fleet, calm and steady despite the horror approaching from every direction. "The silence will attempt to fracture our lines, but we must hold together, for if we break, we fall." The combined forces of humanity and the Galactic Concord spread across the system in a pattern that had been designed through countless hours of collaboration. Human ships formed the outer ring, their fold space disruptors primed and ready behind them. The Concord fleet provided support, their conventional weapons useless against the silence itself, but capable of protecting the human vessels from debris and secondary threats. At the center of the formation, Convergence Station hung like a jewel in the void, its ancient halls filled with the evacuees of a dozen worlds. "The entity is accelerating," reported Technician Bareth from his station beside Yeonsu. His compound eyes flickered. "With data from 1,000 sensors at current speed, it will reach the outer defensive line in approximately 12 minutes. 12 minutes until the battle for the galaxy's future began. Yansu watched as the first wave of human ships moved to intercept the advancing darkness. They were small vessels, corvettes and frigates crewed by volunteers who knew they would not return. Their sacrifice would buy time, precious seconds that would allow the larger ships to position themselves for maximum effect. The first corvette reached the edge of the silence and activated its disruptor. For a brief moment, a tear appeared in the fabric of space, a mirror of the darkness that seemed to cause the entity to hesitate. Then the corvette vanished in a flash of light, and the tear closed behind it, leaving only silence. Contact confirmed, reported a human voice over the fleet channel. The silence has been disrupted. Damage is minimal, but the effect is real. All vessels continue with the plan one by one. The volunteer ships threw themselves at the approaching void. Each one created a moment of hesitation, a fraction of a second where the silence could not advance. Each one cost a crew their lives. Yansu counted them as they fell. 10, 20, 50, 100. Their names scrolling across her display as the human fleet tracked its losses with terrible precision. How can they do this? Whispered Bareth, his clicking growing frantic with distress. How can they send their people to certain death without hesitation? Yansu watched as another ship vanished into light, because they believe that some things are worth dying for. She answered. The battle raged for hours. The silence adapted to each new attack, finding ways around the disruptions, pressing forward through gaps in the defensive line. Human ships fell by the hundreds, their crews choosing sacrifice over retreat. The Kethvarim warriors threw themselves into the fray, their vessels serving as shields for the disruptor ships, buying precious seconds with their own hulls. The Mareshi coordinated the defense through their hive mind, tracking every vessel and every threat with perfect precision. And still a silence came. By the 6th hour, the outer defensive line had collapsed entirely. The Concord fleet had pulled back to a secondary position, their conventional weapons finally finding targets as chunks of destroyed vessels became hazards for surviving ships. Admiral Minjun had taken personal command of a squadron of heavy cruisers, their disruptors creating larger tiers that slowed the silence's advance, but could not stop it. We are losing, High Commander Vethkai said over the command channel, his voice heavy with the weight of command. The entity adapts faster than we can respond, and our losses are approaching 60%. Then we adapt as well, replied Minjun. There was a pause, and when the Admiral spoke again, his voice carried a finality that made Yonsu's crystal heart crack with grief. Eternal Promise is moving to intercept position, he said. All vessels, clear a path. A chorus of protests erupted across the fleet. The Eternal Promise was humanity's flagship, the vessel that carried their leaders, their history, and their hope. Its disruptor array was the most powerful in the Armada, capable of creating a tier large enough to threaten the Silence's core. But using it would mean the destruction of the ship and everyone aboard. Admiral, there must be another way, pleaded a human voice that Yansu recognized as belonging to one of the junior officers. We cannot lose the promise. We cannot lose the galaxy, Minjun replied. The promise has served its purpose. It brought us here, to this moment, to these people who were willing to stand beside us. And now it will serve one final purpose. Yansu watched as the massive flagship began to move, its engines burning bright as it accelerated toward the heart of the silence. On its bridge, she knew, stood Admiral Minjun, an ambassador, J1, and a skeleton crew of volunteers who had chosen to stay. They were not running. They had never been running. She realized now they had been searching for something worth stopping for, worth fighting for, worth dying for, and they had found it here. Among 12 species who had started as strangers and ended as family, Eternal Promise entering final approach, reported a voice across the fleet. All hands, brace for spatial disruption. Yansu closed her eyes and projected a pattern of light that her people used only in moments of deepest reverence. It was a prayer without words, a hope without form, and in the darkness between stars, the eternal promise flew toward its destiny. The news came 3 days after the diplomatic talks began. Yansu was standing in the observation lounge of Convergence Station when the emergency transmission cut through every channel, silencing conversations across a dozen species. Outpost Verith has gone dark, announced the voice of Central Command. All attempts at communication have failed, and the last sensor readings before signal loss showed energy patterns consistent with massive spatial disruption. The lounge erupted into chaos. Yansu pushed through the crowd, her crystalline form flashing urgent patterns as she made her way toward the command center. She had seen those energy readings before, in the data that Ambassador J1 had shared with the Concord delegation. The radiation signature matched perfectly with the records from humanity's destroyed solar system. The silence had followed them by the time she reached the command center. The full scope of the disaster had become clear. 3 outposts had fallen silent within hours of each other, their locations forming a line that pointed directly toward the heart of Concord space, whatever this entity was. It was not wandering aimlessly through the void. It was hunting. And now that it had found a new feeding ground, it would not stop until there was nothing left to consume. The emergency session of the 12 Thrones was the most contentious gathering in the history of the Concord High. Commander Vethkai stood at the center of the chamber, his scales bristling with barely contained fury. "This is their fault," he roared, pointing one clawed finger at the human delegation seated in the observer gallery. "They brought this monster to our doorstep, and now our people are dying because of their presence." Ambassador J1 rose to her feet, and despite the hostility directed at her from every corner of the room, her voice remained calm. "You are correct, High Commander," she said. "The silence followed us across the stars, and for that, we bear responsibility." The admission seemed to take some of the fire out of Vethkai's anger. He had expected denial and deflection, not honest acceptance. "Then, what do you propose to do about it?" demanded Prime Harmonist Solitha of the Arlith. "Your fleet is large, but by your own admission, you have been running from this thing for 300 years, which suggests you cannot defeat it." J1 nodded slowly. "We could not defeat it when we were alone and frightened and unprepared," she acknowledged. "We could not defeat it when we had nothing but the desperate hope of survival driving us forward." She paused, and when she spoke again, her voice carried the weight of generations. "But we are no longer alone." A murmur ran through the chamber. The Mareshi delegation clicked in rapid conversation with their hive mind, processing her words through their collective consciousness. The Kethvorn warriors shifted uneasily, uncertain how to respond to an enemy that offered alliance instead of excuses. "We have studied the silence for 300 years," J1 continued. "We have watched it consume stars and planets. We have analyzed its energy patterns and movement algorithms. And we have learned things that may prove valuable." She gestured, and a holographic display materialized at the center of the chamber. It showed a vast region of space, darker than the void around it, a wound in reality that seemed to drink in the light of nearby stars. "The silence is not indestructible," J1 said. "It exists outside normal space-time, which is why conventional weapons have no effect. But we have developed technology that can create localized disruptions in the fabric of reality itself." The display shifted, showing a human vessel approaching the edge of the darkness. Energy pulsed from the ship's hull, tearing open a small rift that seemed to cause the silence to recoil. "When we mirror its nature, we create something it cannot consume," J1 explained. "But the cost is high. The display showed the human vessel vanishing in a flash of light. Every ship that creates a disruption is destroyed in the process, she said, her voice heavy with grief. We have lost thousands of vessels this way. Thousands of lives sacrificed to slow the Silence's advance. Silence fell over the chamber, and for a long moment, no one spoke. Yansu looked at the human ambassador and saw something she had not expected to find. Not fear, not desperation, but a quiet determination that burned like a star in the darkness. Why are you telling us this? Asked Archive Keeper Thomville. If your technology requires such sacrifice, why share it with us at all? J1 turned to face him, and her eyes held a light that made Yansu's crystalline heart ache with recognition. Because we are tired of running, she said simply. Because for 300 years, we have been alone in the darkness, fighting an enemy that we could not defeat, losing people we loved to avoid that offered nothing but extinction. She looked around the chamber, meeting the eyes of each representative in turn. When we detected your civilizations, we dared to hope for the first time since Earth fell. She continued, we found 12 species who had built something beautiful together. 12 cultures that had learned to set aside their differences and work toward common goals. Her voice cracked slightly, but she pressed on. We found a galaxy worth protecting, and we decided that we would rather die standing beside you than spend another century running alone. High Commander Vethkai rose from his throne. You would sacrifice your ships and your people to defend civilizations you have known for mere days? He asked, and for the first time, his voice held no suspicion, only wonder. J1 smiled, and it was the smile of someone who had finally found what they had been searching for. We would sacrifice everything, she said, not because we expect you to repay us, but because that is who we are. She extended her hand toward the Kethvorum warrior. Humanity does not abandon its friends, she said, and we have waited 300 years to finally have friends worth fighting for. Vethkai stared at her outstretched hand for a long moment. Then, slowly, he reached out and wrapped his massive clawed fingers around her small, soft palm. Then we will fight together, he said around the chamber. Representatives of 11 other species rose to their feet, and Yansu felt tears she did not know she could cry running down her crystalline cheeks. The diplomatic shuttle passed through the human formation in complete silence. Yansu stood at the forward viewport, watching as vessel after vessel drifted past on either side. Each ship was different from the last, as if they had been built by 100 different hands, following 100 different traditions. Some were sleek and angular, their hulls gleaming with metals she could not identify. Others were massive and industrial, covered with the scars of countless repairs and modifications. A few appeared almost organic, their surfaces curved like the shells of great sea creatures from her homeworld. But all of them shared one quality that made her crystalline, form pulse with recognition. They were old. These ships had traveled far and seen much, their age written into every plate and panel. Whatever humanity was, they had not built this fleet overnight. This armada represented generations of work, of struggle, of survival against odds. She could only imagine shuttle carried representatives from all 12 Concord species. Though most had come reluctantly, High Commander Vethkai had insisted on bringing a full security detail of Kethvorum warriors, their weapons barely concealed beneath their ceremonial robes. The Mareshi had sent a delegation of 6, small enough to maintain their hive mind link without overwhelming the other passengers with their constant clicking. Yansu had been asked to join as a scientific advisor. Her expertise in stellar cartography, considered valuable for understanding where these humans might have come from. The flagship loomed ahead, and Yansu felt her breath catch in her chest. The vessel was enormous, easily 3 times the size of the largest Concord battleship. Its hull was covered with symbols and markings in dozens of different scripts. and great windows lined its sides, revealing interior spaces filled with light and movement across its bow. In letters tall enough to be visible from orbit, a name had been painted in gold: Eternal Promise. They named their ship after hope, murmured archive keeper Thomville, standing beside her. That tells us something about who they are. The docking procedure was smooth and professional, and within minutes the Concorde delegation stood in a vast hangar bay filled with smaller craft of every conceivable design. Waiting for them was a group of beings that made Yansu's scientific mind race with questions. The humans were soft. That was her first observation. No scales, no shells, no crystalline structure to protect them from harm. Their bodies were wrapped in fabric of various colors, and their faces were arranged in expressions that her translation systems identified as welcoming. At their head stood a female, her dark hair streaked with gray, and her eyes carrying the weight of someone who had seen too much. "Welcome aboard the Eternal Promise," she said, her voice the same one that had called out across the void. "I am Ambassador J1, and on behalf of all humanity, I thank you for accepting our invitation." High Commander Vethkai stepped forward, his massive form towering over the human female. "You asked us to hear your story," he said, making no effort to hide his suspicion. "We have come to listen, but I warn you, we will know if you speak false." J1 met his gaze without flinching. "We have traveled too far and lost too much time on lies." "High Commander," she gestured toward a corridor leading deeper into the ship. "Please, come with me, and I will show you who we are and why we have come." The walk through the Eternal Promise was unlike anything Yansu had experienced. The humans had transformed their flagship into a living museum, its walls lined with images and artifacts from a world that no longer existed. She saw oceans of deep blue and forests of endless green, mountains capped with snow, and deserts painted in shades of gold and red. She saw cities that reached toward the sky and villages nestled in valleys where rivers sang their ancient songs. And everywhere she looked, she saw humans. They filled the images with their presence, laughing and crying, fighting and loving, building and destroying and building again. "This was Earth," J1 said, stopping before a massive holographic display that showed a blue and white sphere spinning slowly in the void. "Our homeworld. The place where humanity was born." "Was?" asked Thomville, his historian's instincts catching the word. J1 closed her eyes for a moment, and when she opened them again, they glistened with moisture. 300 cycles ago, something came to our solar system, she said. "We never saw it clearly, never understood what it was, but we knew what it did." She touched a control, and the image of Earth began to change. The blue faded to gray. The white clouds turning dark, and poisonous cracks appeared across the surface, spreading like wounds until the entire planet seemed to shatter from within. The silence. "We called it," J1 continued, her voice steady despite the tears running down her cheeks. "It consumed everything. Not just our world, but our sun, our sister planets. Every trace that humanity had ever existed in that corner of space." The chamber was silent. Yansu looked at the other delegates and saw the same expression on every face, horror mixed with dawning understanding. "You are refugees," she said softly. J1 nodded. When the silence came, "We had colonies on distant moons and stations in deep space," she explained. "We gathered everyone we could save, and we ran, not knowing where we were going, only knowing that we could not let our species die." She gestured to the fleet visible through the nearby windows. "This Armada is not a weapon of conquest. It is an ark, carrying the last children of Earth and every piece of our world that we could preserve." High Commander Vethkai shifted uncomfortably. "You said you have been searching for us," he said, his earlier hostility fading into something closer to respect. "Why?" Ye1 smiled, and despite everything, It was a smile of genuine warmth. "Because we have been alone for 300 years," she answered. "We have wandered the stars, hoping and praying that somewhere out there we would find others who might understand." She looked at each delegate in turn, her eyes meeting theirs with an intensity that made Yansu's crystal heart sing. "We are not here to threaten you or take what is yours," J1 said. "We are here because we finally found something worth stopping for." She extended her hand, palm open, in what Yansu's systems identified as a human gesture of peace and friendship. "We are here because we hope that perhaps, after all these years of running, we have finally found a home." The weight of her words settled over the delegation like a blanket. Yansu looked at the images of Earth, at the faces of humans who had laughed and loved on a world now gone forever. She looked at J1, at the strength and sorrow that lived together in her eyes, and she knew that whatever happened next, the galaxy had just changed in ways that none of them could yet imagine. Yansu had studied the stars for 300 cycles, and in all that time she had never seen anything like this. The Velethani astrocartographer stood before the great observation window of Station Meridian, her crystalline body refracting the light of 1,000 distant suns into patterns of deep violet and burning gold. Her species communicated through these colors, and right now every shade she projected screamed a single word: impossible. The sensors had detected the anomaly 6 hours ago. At first, the junior analysts dismissed it as a fold space echo, perhaps the residual energy of some ancient vessel that had passed through this region long before the founding of the Galactic Concord. But echoes faded. This signal grew stronger with every passing moment. "Senior astrocartographer," called a voice from behind her. Yansu turned to find Technician Bareth of the Marishi standing at the Vey entrance to the observation deck. The insectoid being's compound eyes reflected her light patterns, and his mandibles clicked in the rapid sequence that indicated extreme agitation among his kind. "The 12 thrones have been notified," Bareth continued, his voice carrying the harmonic undertones of his hive mind connection. "They are assembling now." "How many signatures?" Yansu asked. Though she had already counted them herself, she needed to hear someone else confirm what her instruments were telling her. Bareth's antennae flattened against his skull. "At current count, 14,273 distinct vessel signatures." He paused, and his clicking grew more frantic. "The number continues to rise." Yansu turned back to the window. 14,000 ships. The entire combined fleet of the Galactic Concord numbered perhaps 8,000 vessels, and that represented the military might of 12 spacefaring civilizations that had spent millennia building their armadas. Whoever these newcomers were, they possessed more raw power than everything the known galaxy could muster. The journey to the Concord's capital station took Yansu 4 hours via priority transport. She spent every moment of that journey analyzing the incoming data, searching for any clue about the identity of these strangers. The vessel signatures matched no known configuration. The energy readings suggested propulsion systems that operated on principles her people had only theorized about, and the sheer scale of the fleet spoke to a civilization that had devoted generations to a single purpose. When she arrived at the grand chamber of the 12 thrones, she found chaos. Representatives of all 12 member species had gathered, their voices rising in a cacophony of languages that the universal translators struggled to process. The Kethvaran delegation stood in one corner, their scaled bodies bristling with barely contained aggression. These warrior beings had not known true battle in over 1,000 cycles, but they had never stopped preparing for it. Across from them, the Orolith floated in their atmospheric containment spheres, their gaseous forms swirling with colors that Yansu recognized as deep concern. The Mareshi had formed their customary cluster, dozens of individuals linking their minds to process information as a single entity. and at the center of it all, on the elevated dais that held the 12 thrones themselves, the leaders of the Concord argued about what action to take. "We must assume hostile intent," declared High Commander Vethkai of the Kethvoran, slamming one clawed fist against the arm of his throne. "No civilization builds a fleet of this magnitude for peaceful purposes. And yet they have made no aggressive moves," countered Prime Harmonist Selitha of the Orlith, a voice emerging from the translation device mounted on her containment sphere. "They have held position at the edge of our territory for hours now, making no attempt to advance, because they are waiting," Vethkai growled, "studying our defenses, identifying our weaknesses, or perhaps," said Yansu, her light patterns flaring bright enough to draw every eye in the chamber, "they are waiting for us to respond." The chamber fell silent. A senior astrocartographer did not normally address the 12 thrones directly, but Yansu had spent 4 hours studying the data, and she had noticed something that changed everything. "They are broadcasting," she continued, projecting her findings onto the central display, a continuous transmission on multiple frequencies. Using multiple encoding methods, she manipulated the display, isolating the signal 17 languages, including 3 that have not been spoken in this galaxy for over 10,000 cycles. "Impossible," said Archive Keeper Thomval of the Sundari. Leaning forward on his throne, his species maintained the historical records of the Concord, and his memory was said to encompass the entirety of galactic civilization. "Those languages died with the civilizations that spoke them. And yet someone is speaking them now," Yansu replied. She activated the translation matrix, and a voice filled the chamber. It was warm and steady, carrying no threat, only a patience that seemed to stretch across centuries. "We are humanity," the voice said. "We have been searching for you for a very long time." The words hung in the air like a physical presence. Yansu watched as the representatives of 12 civilizations struggled to process what they had heard. Humanity. The name appeared in no database, no archive, no historical record spanning millions of cycles of galactic history. These beings had emerged from the void, as if they had sprung into existence fully formed, with a fleet that dwarfed anything the Concord had ever assembled. "What do they want?" whispered someone in the crowd, as if in answer. The transmission continued. "We come in peace, seeking friends and allies among the stars." The voice carried a weight of sorrow that made Yansu's crystalline heart resonate with unexpected emotion. "We have traveled very far, and we have lost much along the way." There was a pause, and when the voice resumed, it seemed to speak directly to every being in the chamber. "We ask only for the chance to speak with you, to share our story, and to learn yours." High Commander Vethkai opened his mouth to object, but before he could speak, the display updated with new information. The fleet was moving, not advancing, not threatening, but reorganizing itself into a formation that every military mind in the chamber immediately recognized. They were creating a corridor, a safe passage through their ranks, an invitation. "They want us to come to them," Yansu said, her light patterns shifting to shades of wonder. "They are opening their arms." The 12 thrones looked at one another, and for the first time in 8,000 cycles of alliance, not one of them knew what to say. Somewhere at the edge of known space, an armada of impossible size waited with impossible patience, and the galaxy held its breath.